got into Node years ago, I was surprised at the lack of structure provided. In that wide open field, I had to come up with some way of organizing my app. It worked for a while, but practice and experience are great teachers. As our last few episodes have shown, the structure is crumbling. While it works for simple applications, it's not going to take us or Node Slash where we want to go. In this episode, we're going to talk at a high level about what's wrong and the principles we're going to use to improve it. Back in episode 8, I said, we get to see a judicious use of a global variable. I no longer think that's right. Let's time-lapse our app object. So it started like this, and then looked like this, and this, and then this, and this. Finally, we've arrived at... I made this same complaint about ORMs and ODMs. I stand by that complaint, so we need to do something about this object. Now we've been stashing all of our files in about 3 directories: app middlewares, app models, and app routes. So by browsing the top of our app folder, we can tell that Node Slash has middleware, a data model of some sort, and route handlers. Show me an app that doesn't. This directory structure groups our app by file type. File types don't exactly map to application functionality. Dealing with our users spans all 3 of these directories. What if we could group our files by what they do rather than by what form they have? And then there's hidden dependencies throughout the app. Here's a real gem. This is part of the old code that used to power the Learn All the Nodes website. Now I built it using the same structure that we've been doing with Node Slash. By opening this file, I can see that it uses Mongoose. But I had to open the file to do that. ODMs and ORMs want to accumulate more and more functionality, and as they do so, they acquire more and more require statements. I've worked on projects where the first 10 to 30 lines of a file are requires. Now, I would contend that if a module depends on that many things, perhaps that module is doing too much. By hiding those dependencies behind a nice, easy to invoke global function like require, we don't feel that pain, so we don't perceive the problem. Morphine can numb a broken bone, but the bone is still broken. And then there's testing. Hidden dependencies also complicate testing. At least they make it harder to zoom in on individual units. Why? Well, consider app routes portal characters routes.js. We can't test these functions without the actual user model. This file is very tightly coupled with the actual user model, which in turn is completely coupled to the actual database. You do an integration test through it all, or you do nothing. These routes are pretty simple, sure, but not every route is. When you test entire subsystems at once and something goes wrong, well, you're in for a real treat trying to isolate where the problem was. If you've ever seen an industrial production line, you may have noticed that the system doesn't just have an input and an output, with everything in between being closed off. Now, if you haven't seen one, may I suggest binge watching several seasons of how it's made. But imagine if those production lines were that way. Your real problem is some minor machine 5 steps down the line. You notice there's a problem and you disassemble the whole production line, attempt to fix, reconstruct the whole production line, and then try running another unit of production. Wouldn't it be nicer to be able to test that little machine in isolation? Now I've given the spiel about Cthulhu's tentacles back in episode 43, so I won't belabor the point here. Node Slash uses these so-called model objects everywhere. We'll be changing that. In the episodes to come, we're going to look at a number of techniques and language features that we can use to produce a structure that's easier to test, use, and maintain. My thinking on this is very heavily influenced by the principles of functional programming and 3 fantastic resources I've come across. The first of those 3 resources is a simple tweet from Jessica Kerr. Now, command line applications and web apps have more in common than you may think. The quote-unquote web in web app is just a transport layer, how it gets its inputs. Who cares if that comes from the web or from a command line? To the core of the application, if you have good boundaries, it doesn't matter. Speaking of boundaries, the second is a presentation Gary Bernhardt gave called Boundaries. Go watch it. If you like what you saw there, consider going more into it with his Functional Core Imperative Shell screencasts. Now the third thing is an article by Uncle Bob Martin called The Clean Architecture. Uncle Bob and I have different opinions on Vim, but this article does a fantastic job of explaining how to keep proper system boundaries in your code. I consider that tweet, Gary Bernhardt's Boundaries, and Uncle Bob's The Clean Architecture to be essential viewing and reading if your interest is in building healthy systems, so please go partake in their wisdom. So what's next? The process of fixing Node Slash and preparething it for its glorious future is going to be an exercise of applying these principles to our app. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to need to learn some new techniques and make sure we have a firm grasp of some JavaScript fundamentals to make that happen. We'll get back to writing code with the next episode, so until then, happy coding.